Looking back now, I can't help but smile when I remember the phone call my sister Madison made to sabotage my promotion. Not because what she did was funny, but because of the spectacular way it backfired on her. I'm Emma Reeves, 28 years old, and I work in tech sales at a software company in Austin, Texas. Madison is my older sister, 32, and for as long as I can remember, she's been the golden child in our family while I've been the afterthought. The one whose accomplishments were met with polite nods, while hers received standing ovations. Our parents, Robert and Linda, never seemed to notice the disparity in how they treated us, or maybe they did notice and just didn't care. I'm still not entirely sure which possibility hurts more. Madison has always needed to be the center of attention, the star of every show, and any success I achieved was treated like a personal attack against her, something that diminished her shine rather than something we could celebrate together as sisters. She works as a retail manager at a mid-tier department store, a job she complains about constantly but never seems motivated to leave, while I've built a career in enterprise software sales that I'm genuinely proud of. 3 months ago, my manager David told me I was being considered for a promotion to senior account executive, a position that would come with a significant salary increase, an equity package, and the opportunity to lead my own team. I was thrilled and terrified in equal measure, and I made the mistake of mentioning it at a family dinner when my mother directly asked about work, thinking maybe this time would be different. Maybe this achievement would finally be big enough to earn their genuine excitement. Madison's smile had tightened immediately, that familiar expression I'd seen since childhood whenever something good happened to me, and she'd changed the subject within 30 seconds, later making a dismissive comment about how sales jobs were really just about schmoozing and luck rather than real skill. My parents had offered their standard lukewarm response, a quick, "That's good, honey," before turning back to Madison's story about some minor drama with her store's inventory system, and I'd felt that old familiar ache of being invisible in my own family. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't discover until 2 weeks later, was that Madison's jealousy over my potential promotion had grown into something darker and more desperate, something that would push her to pick up the phone and try to destroy my career with lies and manipulation, and that when she made that call, she would make one critical mistake that would change everything. The pattern started so early that I can't actually remember a time when things were different between Madison and me. When our parents treated us like we were equally important, equally worthy of their attention and pride. Madison was born first, 4 years before me, and she established herself as the star of the family before I even existed, which meant I was always playing catch-up in a race I didn't know I'd entered and could never win. I remember being 7 years old, bringing home a report card with straight A's, so excited to show my parents because I'd worked incredibly hard in math, a subject that didn't come naturally to me, and my mother had glanced at it, said, "That's nice, dear," and immediately returned her attention to helping Madison prepare for some middle school dance that apparently required hours of discussion and a special shopping trip. That same year, Madison had gotten mostly B's with a few C's, and my parents had taken her out to her favorite restaurant to celebrate her improvement in English, making it this big family event while my straight A's were acknowledged with a distracted nod. When Madison graduated high school, there was a huge party with extended family, catered food, a photo slideshow, the works. But when my turn came 4 years later, we had a small family dinner at home because, as my father explained, they'd already done the big celebration for a graduation, and it seemed excessive to do it twice. The college situation was even worse, though I didn't fully understand the extent of the inequality until years later. Madison decided to attend our state university, Texas State, and my parents paid her full tuition, room and board, spending money, everything, telling her to focus on her studies and not worry about working. When I graduated high school with better grades and got accepted to the same university, I naturally assumed I'd receive the same support. But 2 months before classes started, my father sat me down and explained they'd be helping as much as they could, but I'd need to take out loans for most of it. I remember asking why it was different from Madison's situation, and he'd gotten uncomfortable, said something vague about their financial situation being tighter now, though I later learned he'd bought a new truck that same year and my parents had gone on a cruise to Alaska. I graduated with $40,000 in student loan debt that took me 6 years of aggressive payments to finally clear, money I could have used for a down payment on a house or invested for my future, while Madison graduated debt-free and used her early career years to travel and enjoy her life. The wedding situation was perhaps the most blatant example of their favoritism. Madison got engaged at 27 to her husband Kyle, and my parents immediately announced they were contributing $30,000 toward the wedding, which allowed Madison to have her dream ceremony at a beautiful venue with 200 guests, an open bar, a live band, the whole extravagant experience. At the engagement party, I remember my mother going on and on about how happy she was to give her eldest daughter the wedding she deserved, and I was genuinely happy for Madison then, not yet understanding what this generosity would mean for my own future. 2 years later, when I started dating someone seriously and the topic of eventual weddings came up at a family dinner, I'd mentioned something about hoping to get married someday, and my mother had smiled and said they'd love to contribute what they could, maybe around $5,000, which was a nice gesture but nothing like what Madison had received. When I gently pointed out the disparity, my father had actually seemed annoyed, suggesting that Madison's wedding had been expensive and they couldn't afford to do that again, and besides, I made good money now in tech sales, so surely I could fund most of my own wedding. The message was clear. Madison deserved their financial support and generosity, while I was expected to be self-sufficient and grateful for whatever scraps they offered. Even now, at our monthly family dinners, the dynamic continued like a script we'd all memorized. Madison would talk about the challenges of retail management, the difficult customers, the inventory issues, the staffing problems, and my parents would listen with rapt attention, offering sympathy and advice, treating her retail job like she was running a Fortune 500 company, while my career in enterprise software sales was dismissed as just sales or schmoozing clients, as if it required no skill or intelligence. I'd stopped bringing up my accomplishments years ago because the pattern was too painful to keep experiencing. My achievements were met with, "That's nice, honey," before the conversation immediately pivoted back to Madison, while her smallest victories were celebrated like she'd won a Nobel Prize. I learned to make myself smaller at these gatherings, to take up less space, to not mention my quota achievements or major deals or professional recognition, because any success I shared seemed to cast a shadow over Madison that my parents found unacceptable. And the implicit message was always that her comfort and happiness mattered more than mine. 3 months before Madison made her catastrophic phone call, my manager David Chen called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon in late June, and I remember my hands were trembling slightly as I walked down the hallway because unscheduled meetings with your manager rarely mean good news, or at least that's what my anxious brain always assumed. David was in his mid-40s, a straightforward guy who'd been with the company for 8 years and had a reputation for being fair and direct. And when I sat down across from his desk, he smiled and said, "Emma, I wanted to talk to you about an opportunity that's opening up." And I felt my heart rate spike because opportunity could mean anything from a new account assignment to something much bigger. He explained that our senior account executive, Marcus Webb, was leaving to join a startup, which meant there would be an opening on the team, a leadership position that came with significant responsibility and compensation. And he said, "I'm recommending you for the role, and I wanted you to know before the formal process begins." The position would come with a salary of $140,000, up from my current $95,000, plus an equity package that would vest over 4 years, and I'd be leading a team of 4 account executives while managing our largest enterprise clients, the Fortune 500 accounts that represented the most revenue and the most complexity. David walked me through my track record, how I'd been the top performer on the sales team for 2 years running, how I'd brought in $3.2 million in new contract value last year alone, exceeding my quota by 48%, and how multiple clients had specifically praised my strategic thinking and partnership approach in their quarterly business reviews. I felt this surge of pride and terror in equal measure because this was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been working toward, the kind of career progression I dreamed about when I first got into tech sales 5 years ago. But I was also terrified of failing, of being promoted beyond my capabilities, of somehow proving that I didn't deserve it. David must have seen something in my expression because he said, "You've earned this consideration, Emma. Your numbers speak for themselves." And I thanked him, trying to keep my voice professional even though I wanted to cry with happiness and anxiety. The formal decision wouldn't be made for another 3 months, he explained, because they needed to interview other candidates and go through the proper process. But he wanted me to know I was the internal frontrunner and he was fully supporting my candidacy. I left his office feeling like I was floating, this incredible mix of excitement and disbelief, and I immediately wanted to share the news with someone, to celebrate this moment that felt like validation of all the long hours and difficult clients and quota pressure I'd endured. That evening, I found myself at my parents' house for our monthly family dinner, something I'd been attending dutifully for years, even though they often left me feeling diminished and invisible. And when my mother asked about work, I made the mistake of telling them about the promotion opportunity, breaking my usual rule of keeping my professional achievements to myself. I explained the role, the increase in responsibility, what it would mean for my career, and I could hear the excitement in my own voice, that vulnerability of hoping this time would be different, this achievement would finally be big enough to earn their genuine pride. Madison's face had done that familiar thing, that subtle tightening around her smile that I'd learned to recognize over decades. The expression that said, my success was somehow an injury to her. And within 30 seconds, she'd changed the subject to some situation at her store involving a difficult vendor, reclaiming the attention. My parents had offered their standard response, my mother saying, "That's good, honey," with the same tone she might use if I'd told her I'd tried a new restaurant, before immediately engaging with Madison's story, asking follow-up questions, and offering sympathy for her retail challenges. My father had nodded vaguely in my direction and said something about sales being a good field before turning his full attention back to Madison, and I'd felt that old familiar ache of being the supporting character in my own family's story, present but not particularly important. I realized as I drove home that night that I should have kept quiet, should have protected this piece of good news from the family dynamic that always seemed to shrink my accomplishments down to nothing. But part of me had still hoped that maybe this time would be different. Maybe a promotion this significant would finally break through their indifference. The following weeks after that family dinner were a slow torture of watching Madison's jealousy manifest in increasingly pointed ways. Though at first I tried to tell myself I was being oversensitive, that I was reading malice into innocent comments because of my own insecurity about the promotion. It started with the family group chat, which had always been Madison's preferred stage for performing her life and soliciting sympathy, and suddenly, there was a noticeable uptick in her posts about how exhausting and difficult her retail management job was, how she dealt with truly challenging situations every single day, how real work meant being on your feet solving problems in real time, not sitting in air-conditioned offices. She never mentioned me by name, but the implication was impossible to miss, especially when she posted things like, "Some jobs are about actual hard work, not just schmoozing clients over expensive lunches," accompanied by a photo of herself looking exhausted in her store uniform. I watched my mother like several of these posts, each heart reaction feeling like a small endorsement of Madison's narrative that her work was somehow more legitimate, more worthy of respect than mine. My friend Jasmine, who I'd met during my first year at the company and who had become my closest confidant, noticed that I was coming back from lunch breaks looking deflated and anxious. And when she finally asked what was wrong, I showed her some of Madison's posts, expecting Jasmine to tell me I was overreacting. Instead, Jasmine had looked at me with this expression of genuine concern and said, "Emma, this is not normal sibling stuff. This is targeted and mean," and suggested I set some boundaries with my family, maybe step back from the group chat for a while. But I felt this crushing guilt at the thought of protecting myself because wasn't family supposed to be forever? Wasn't I supposed to just tolerate this because Madison was my sister? The passive-aggressive posts continued for 2 weeks, each one a fresh paper cut. But then Madison shifted tactics and called me directly one evening, her voice honey-sweet and concerned, asking how I was doing, how work was going, and I felt myself desperately wanting to believe this was genuine sisterly interest, that maybe she'd moved past her initial negative reaction to my news. She asked specific questions about the promotion timeline, when the final decision would be made, who exactly was involved in making the choice, and I remember feeling this flutter of warning in my chest, but pushing it down because I wanted so badly to trust her, to believe that my own sister wouldn't actually try to hurt me. I told her about David Chen, my direct manager who was championing my candidacy, and mentioned that Patricia Monroe, our VP of sales, would also be involved in the final decision, and Madison had made these interested humming noises, asked me how to spell their names correctly, because she wanted to send good thoughts to the right people, which should have sounded absurd, but in the moment felt almost touching, like maybe she really did want to support me. Her tone throughout the call was solicitous, almost exaggeratedly interested in the details, asking questions about the company structure, how many employees we had, whether we had a main office number, and I answered without thinking, because this was my sister, the person who had known me my entire life. And surely that meant something. Surely that created some baseline of loyalty and care that would prevent her from using this information against me. 2 weeks before the final promotion decision was scheduled to be made, Madison sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and a determination that felt righteous and necessary, convincing herself that what she was about to do was actually an act of protection, a way of saving her little sister from inevitable failure and humiliation. Though if she'd been honest with herself, she would have admitted that the hot, jealous feeling in her chest had nothing to do with concern and everything to do with the fact that Emma's success felt like a personal attack on Madison's worth. She navigated to Emma's company website, clicking through to the About Us section and then to the leadership page, scanning faces and names until she found the contact information she needed, and there in the corporate directory was David Chen, sales manager, with a direct phone number listed right beneath his professional headshot. Madison didn't realize, couldn't have known, that there were two David Chens employed at the company, that the directory listed both, but that the phone number she was looking at actually belonged to David Park, the CEO who had relocated to the Austin headquarters just 6 months earlier, and whose contact information had been accidentally placed under the wrong David's profile due to a recent website update that hadn't been fully quality checked. She picked up her phone with hands that were steady despite what she was about to do, dialed the number, and felt her heart racing as it rang once, twice, 3 times before a male voice answered with a simple, "This is David." Madison launched into the script she'd been rehearsing in her head for the past hour, her voice taking on this tone of concerned gravity as she said, "Hi, my name is Madison Reeves, and I'm calling because I feel I have a responsibility to share some information about Emma Reeves, who I understand is being considered for a promotion in your department." And she paused as if this was difficult for her, as if she was struggling with the moral weight of what she had to say. The voice on the other end stayed quiet, professional, simply acknowledging her with, "I see, go on." And that neutral response emboldened Madison to continue, made her feel like she was being taken seriously, listened to in a way that Emma's accomplishments had made Madison feel invisible. She spoke carefully, planting seeds of doubt with practiced precision, saying things like, "I'm Emma's sister, and I love her, but I've noticed some concerning patterns that I think you should be aware of." And then she mentioned Emma's supposed history of exaggerating her accomplishments, of presenting herself as more capable than she actually was, of taking credit for team efforts as if they were solo achievements. Madison could feel herself getting more confident as she spoke, the voice on the other end asking occasional clarifying questions that she interpreted as interest and concern rather than what they actually were, which was David Park carefully gathering information about who this person was and what exactly she was trying to accomplish. She went further, suggesting that Emma had been lying about her sales numbers, that there were personal problems affecting Emma's judgment, that she was worried Emma wasn't stable enough to handle the increased pressure and responsibility of a senior role, and she delivered all of this in a tone of sorrowful concern, as if it pained her to say these things about her own sister, but duty compelled her to speak up. The voice asked, "And you said your name was Madison Reeves?" And she confirmed it, spelling out her last name, and when he asked for a contact number where he could reach her if he had follow-up questions, she provided her cell phone number without hesitation, believing that this was a sign that her concerns were being taken seriously, that she'd successfully planted enough doubt to derail Emma's promotion. And when she finally hung up the phone, she felt this complicated mixture of triumph and guilt, telling herself again that she'd done the right thing, that she was protecting Emma from failure, when really, she'd just tried to destroy her sister's career because she couldn't stand watching Emma succeed where Madison felt herself failing. What Madison didn't know, couldn't have possibly known as she sat at her kitchen table, feeling that complicated mixture of triumph and shame, was that the man she'd just spent 15 minutes speaking to wasn't David Chen, Emma's sales manager who oversaw a team of 12 account executives from his corner office on the third floor, but was instead David Park, the 46-year-old CEO of the entire company who had relocated from the San Francisco headquarters to Austin just 6 months earlier as part of the company's strategic expansion into the Texas market. David Park had ended the call with Madison by thanking her for reaching out, his voice remaining professionally neutral as he asked for her contact information. And when Madison had provided her full name and cell phone number without hesitation, he'd written it down carefully, telling her he would be in touch if he needed any additional information. And Madison had hung up feeling like she'd successfully planted the seeds of doubt that would derail Emma's promotion, never imagining that what she'd actually done was expose herself completely to the one person in the company with the authority and insight to see her actions for exactly what they were. David Park sat in his office after the call ended, a spacious corner suite on the executive floor with windows overlooking downtown Austin, and felt the immediate recognition that what he'd just heard was attempted sabotage, the kind of toxic family interference that he'd seen destroy promising careers before, and his first instinct was to protect the employee who was being targeted rather than to simply accept the allegations at face value. He opened his laptop and pulled up Emma's personnel file, scanning through 2 years of performance reviews that were consistently excellent, quarterly sales numbers that had been verified and audited by the finance department, and a track record that showed she'd brought in $3.2 million in contracts over the past year alone, making her one of the top 3 performers in the entire sales division. David recalled meeting Emma briefly at the company all-hands meeting 2 months earlier, remembered being impressed by her presentation on client relationship strategies, the way she'd spoken confidently, but without arrogance about the importance of listening to customer needs rather than pushing products. And he'd made a mental note at the time that she was someone to watch, someone with leadership potential beyond her current role. This phone call from her sister didn't align with anything in Emma's file or with his own observations of her professionalism, and David recognized it immediately as what it was, a malicious attempt to interfere with Emma's career advancement by someone who was threatened by her success. He picked up his office phone and called down to the third floor, asking David Chen to come up to the executive suite, and when Emma's manager arrived 10 minutes later looking slightly anxious about being summoned by the CEO, David Park gestured for him to sit down and said, "I just received a very interesting phone call about Emma Reeves, and I need to know everything about her promotion candidacy." David Chen's face had shifted from anxiety to confusion to shock as the CEO relayed the details of Madison's call, and he'd immediately confirmed that Emma was indeed his top candidate for the senior account executive position, that her numbers were absolutely legitimate and verified, and that he'd never seen any indication of instability or dishonesty in her work. The two men discussed how to handle the situation, agreeing that Emma needed to be protected from this interference, that the promotion decision should proceed based solely on her merit and performance, and that Emma would need to be informed about what had happened so she could make decisions about how to handle her family situation, but that they would make it absolutely clear that her sister's actions had no bearing whatsoever on their assessment of Emma's qualifications or character. During all of this, during Madison's calculated phone call to what she thought was my manager, and the subsequent conversation between David Park and David Chen about how to handle the situation, I remained completely oblivious to the sabotage attempt, focused instead on what I thought was the most important challenge I was facing, which was closing a major deal with an enterprise client called Horizon Technologies that would be worth $850,000 in annual recurring revenue if I could just get them across the finish line. I'd been working on the Horizon account for 3 months, coordinating with our solutions engineers to customize a proposal that would address their specific needs, staying up late to perfect my pitch deck, running through objection handling scenarios in my head during my commute, and the final presentation was scheduled for that Thursday, just days after Madison had made her poisonous phone call to my company. I was working until 7 or 8 most evenings that week, my desk covered with product specifications and competitive analysis reports, and Jasmine noticed the stress I was carrying in my shoulders. The way I'd started bringing my lunch to eat at my desk instead of joining the team in the break room. She stopped by my cubicle on Wednesday afternoon with 2 cups of coffee and said, "Conference room, now you need a break." And I followed her to one of the small meeting rooms where we could talk privately. Jasmine set the coffee in front of me and asked how I was really doing, and I found myself admitting that I was anxious about more than just the Horizon deal, that Madison had been even colder than usual lately, that our last few text exchanges had felt tense and weird, and that I was starting to wonder if maybe I should just withdraw my name from consideration for the promotion to keep peace with my family. Jasmine looked at me like I'd suggested setting myself on fire and said, "That's insane, Emma. Your career isn't about your sister's feelings, you know that, right?" And I heard myself saying something I'd never quite articulated before, that I'd always felt like I had to make myself smaller so Madison could feel bigger, that taking up space in my family had always felt dangerous, like it would lead to conflict or disappointment, or this subtle withdrawal of whatever limited approval I usually received. Jasmine reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and told me that was a pattern I needed to break, that I deserved to succeed without apologizing for it. And something in her words hit me right in the chest, this breakthrough moment where I realized that I'd been living my entire life, trying not to outshine my sister, trying not to make my parents uncomfortable with my achievements, shrinking myself down to a size that wouldn't threaten anyone else's sense of importance. I went into the Horizon presentation the next day with a clarity I hadn't felt before, delivered my pitch with confidence that came from somewhere deeper than just product knowledge. And when the CEO of Horizon Technologies shook my hand afterward and said, "Your professionalism and attention to detail throughout this process have been exceptional. We're ready to move forward," I felt this surge of pride that had nothing to do with anyone else's validation. David Chen was waiting when I got back to the office, and he congratulated me with genuine warmth, told me I'd done outstanding work on the account, and then he said something that felt slightly odd at the time, that he wanted to discuss something important with me after the promotion decision was finalized, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite read, a mixture of concern and protectiveness that I attributed to the general stress everyone was under as the quarter was closing. The week of the final decision arrived with a kind of suspended anticipation that made it hard for me to focus on anything else. Every meeting and phone call feeling like it was happening at a distance while I waited for news about the promotion. And then on Tuesday afternoon, David Chen stopped by my desk and said, "Emma, can you come to conference room B at 2 o'clock? "There's someone from leadership who wants to meet with you." And my stomach immediately dropped because this wasn't how I'd imagined the promotion conversation would happen. I'd thought it would be just David and me in his office, and the phrase, "someone from leadership," made me wonder if something had gone wrong. If maybe they'd decided to go with another candidate and wanted to deliver the news with a witness present. I spent the hour before the meeting trying to prepare myself for disappointment, telling myself that I'd done everything I could and that not getting the promotion this time didn't mean I wouldn't have other opportunities. But my hands were shaking slightly as I walked down the hallway to the conference room at exactly 2 o'clock. I opened the door and found David Chen already seated at the table, and next to him was David Park, the CEO of the entire company, a man I'd only met once briefly at the all-hands meeting months ago, and my first thought was pure panic, wondering why the CEO would be involved in a senior account executive promotion decision unless something had gone seriously wrong. David Park stood up as I entered and extended his hand with a warm smile, saying, "Emma, thank you for joining us. Please sit down." And I shook his hand and took a seat across from them, my mind racing through every possible reason the CEO might be in this room. David Park started by congratulating me on closing the Horizon Technologies deal, saying that he'd heard excellent things about how I'd handled the account and that the client had specifically praised my professionalism in their contract negotiations. And I thanked him while trying to figure out where this conversation was going. He explained that he liked to personally meet with rising leaders before major promotions, that it was important to him to understand the people who would be shaping the company's future, and I felt some of my panic subside as I realized this might actually be a positive meeting rather than the disaster I'd been imagining. David Park asked me about my career goals, about my approach to client relationships, and how I thought about building trust with customers, and I found myself relaxing slightly as I answered, talking about the importance of really listening to what clients needed rather than just pushing products, about how I believed the best sales relationships were built on solving problems rather than just hitting quotas. He nodded thoughtfully and then asked about my leadership philosophy, what kind of manager I hoped to be if I was given the opportunity to lead a team. And I told him that I believed in supporting other people's success, in lifting up the people around me, and creating an environment where everyone could do their best work. And as I said it, I thought about how that was exactly what had been missing in my family, that spirit of wanting to see each other succeed. Then David Park asked a question that seemed to come from nowhere. He said, "Tell me about your family support system, Emma. Do you have people in your life who celebrate your achievements?" And I hesitated, completely caught off guard by the personal nature of the question, finally saying carefully that my family was complicated, that I had good friends who supported me, but that family dynamics weren't always easy, and David Park nodded in a way that suggested he understood more than I'd said, commenting that sometimes our biggest obstacles came from unexpected places, and I had no idea what he meant by that, but something in his tone made me feel like this meeting was about more than just a standard promotion interview. David Park leaned back in his chair and said, "Emma, I'd like to officially offer you the position of Senior Account Executive, effective immediately." And for a moment, I couldn't quite process the words, couldn't believe that after all the anxiety and waiting and wondering if Madison's coldness meant she somehow knew something I didn't, it was actually happening. I was actually getting the promotion. David Chen smiled at me from across the table as David Park continued, explaining that the position came with a salary of $140,000, a significant equity package that would vest over 4 years, and leadership responsibility for a team of 4 account executives, and I felt this surge of pure joy mixed with disbelief, thanking them both professionally, even though I wanted to cry or laugh, or maybe do both at once. I stood up to leave, my mind already racing ahead to calling Jasmine and figuring out how to tell my family and what this would mean for my career trajectory. But as I reached for the door handle, David Park said, "Emma, please sit back down for a moment. There's something else I need to discuss with you." And the serious tone in his voice made my stomach drop. because I couldn't imagine what else there could be to talk about, unless somehow there was a condition attached to the promotion, or a problem I didn't know about. David Chen excused himself quietly, and I realized he'd known this second part of the conversation was coming, and I sat back down across from David Park, feeling my earlier joy crystallize into anxiety. The CEO's expression shifted from warmth to something more protective and serious, and he said, "I need to tell you something that happened last week, something that could have affected your promotion, but ultimately didn't because of a fortunate mistake." And I felt completely confused, having no idea what he could possibly mean. David Park explained that someone had called the company attempting to sabotage my promotion, that this person had reached out claiming to be a concerned family member with information about my professional conduct, and I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications of what he was saying started to register. He described how the caller had made false allegations, had claimed that I had a history of exaggerating my accomplishments, that I'd been lying about my sales numbers, that I had personal problems affecting my judgment, and that the company should seriously reconsider promoting me to a leadership position. And with each detail he shared, I felt my face burning hotter with humiliation because I knew exactly who had made that call. There was only one person who would do something like that. I started to apologize, the words tumbling out automatically because I felt responsible somehow for bringing this toxicity into my workplace. But David Park held up his hand and said firmly, "Emma, you have nothing to apologize for, nothing at all." And he explained that they had immediately verified every claim, had pulled my entire file and confirmed that my record was impeccable, that every number I'd ever reported had been verified by finance, that my client feedback was consistently outstanding, and that the accusations were clearly malicious and completely unfounded. Then he said something that made my heart stop. He said, "The call almost worked. It almost accomplished exactly what the caller intended, except for one important detail." And he explained that there were two David Chens in the company, that Madison had looked up my manager's name in the corporate directory, but had accidentally called David Park instead of David Chen, and I saw something almost like a smile cross his face as he said, "Your sister called the CEO by mistake, Emma, and that mistake may have saved your career." I sat there in the conference room, feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath me, experiencing this overwhelming rush of emotions that were so tangled together I couldn't separate them into anything coherent. There was anger that made my hands clench against the table, a deep, cutting betrayal that Madison would actually do this to me, humiliation that my CEO now knew about my toxic family dynamics. But underneath all of that was something else. Something that felt almost like relief, because finally I had proof, concrete, undeniable evidence that Madison's sabotage wasn't just in my head, wasn't me being too sensitive or reading too much into things the way my parents always suggested when I tried to talk about how Madison treated me. David Park was watching me carefully, giving me space to process what he'd just told me, and after a long moment he asked gently, "Emma, do you know who made this call?" And I realized this was my moment of truth. I could protect Madison the way I'd always protected her, could make up some vague story about not knowing who might have done this, could maintain the family peace the way I'd been trained to do my entire life, or I could finally tell the truth, even though I knew exactly what the consequences would be. I took a deep breath and said, "I believe it was my older sister Madison." And saying her name out loud in this context felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. Like I was violating some fundamental family loyalty rule that had been drilled into me since childhood. But I kept going, briefly explaining that Madison and I had a complicated relationship, that she'd always struggled with my career success, that there had been a pattern of her trying to undermine my achievements in smaller ways, but nothing like this, nothing this deliberate and destructive. David Park nodded slowly and said, "The caller left her full name and number when I asked for her contact information. She identified herself as Madison Reeves." And hearing him confirm it made everything feel horribly real. My sister had actually done this, had actually tried to destroy my career. And she'd been stupid enough or arrogant enough to give the CEO her real name. because she'd thought she was talking to my direct manager and wouldn't face any consequences. David Park leaned forward and said something that I would remember for years afterward. He said, "Emma, your success isn't something you need to apologize for or hide, and it's not something that should be weaponized against you by people who claim to love you." And I felt tears burning behind my eyes because no one in my family had ever said anything like that to me, had ever suggested that I had a right to succeed without making myself smaller to accommodate everyone else's insecurities. He suggested that I might need to set some boundaries with my family, that what Madison had done wasn't just sibling rivalry, but something much more serious, and he offered me access to the company's employee assistance program, mentioned that they had counseling services available if I wanted to talk to someone about family dynamics and workplace stress. I thanked him, my voice not quite steady, and then asked what happened now with the promotion, if this situation changed anything about the position I'd just been offered, and David Park's expression became very firm as he said, "Nothing changes, Emma. Absolutely nothing. You earned this promotion based entirely on your work, your results, and your potential as a leader, period." And I felt something shift inside me, some fundamental understanding that my worth wasn't determined by my family's opinion of me, but by what I actually accomplished and who I actually was. I left the conference room feeling emotionally overwhelmed, like I'd just survived something intense and wasn't quite sure how to process it. And I walked to my car in a daze, sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the steering wheel, and pulled out my phone to text Jasmine. "You won't believe what just happened." I drove home to my apartment in a daze, barely registering the traffic on I-35 or the familiar turns into my neighborhood, my mind racing through everything David Park had told me, replaying Madison's voice on what must have been that call, imagining her sitting at home researching my company online and deliberately planning how to destroy my career, and the reality of it kept hitting me in waves that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. This wasn't like the passive-aggressive comments on the family group chat or the subtle digs at family dinners. This wasn't Madison making a snide remark about my job being just sales or posting something vague about people who got lucky in their careers. This was active sabotage. This was my sister calling my workplace with the specific intention of getting me fired or at least preventing my promotion, and I had proof now. Concrete, undeniable evidence that all those years of feeling dismissed and minimized and made to feel like I was too sensitive weren't just in my head. I pulled into my parking spot and sat there for a long moment, feeling this strange mixture of vindication and grief, because part of me had always hoped I was wrong about Madison, had always wanted to believe that she loved me despite the jealousy, that family meant something more than this ugly competition I'd never signed up for. My phone buzzed with a text from Jasmine asking if I was okay, and I realized I'd sent her that cryptic message about not believing what had just happened, and then gone silent for the entire drive home, so I texted back asking if she could call me, and within seconds my phone was ringing. I answered and just started talking, explaining everything about the CEO meeting and the promotion, and then the revelation about Madison's call. And Jasmine's reaction was immediate fury on my behalf. She said, "Emma, she tried to destroy your career. You know that, right? This isn't sibling rivalry. This is something so far beyond normal that you need to confront her." And I felt my stomach clench because I knew she was right, but the thought of confronting Madison directly terrified me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Jasmine asked what I was going to do, and I heard myself say I didn't know, that maybe I should just let it go, that confronting Madison would only cause more family drama. And Jasmine said something that stopped me cold. She said, "When has staying quiet ever helped you, Emma? When has making yourself smaller ever made them treat you better?" And I realized she was absolutely right, that I'd spent 28 years trying to keep the peace and avoid conflict and protect everyone else's feelings. And where had it gotten me except to this moment where my own sister had tried to sabotage my promotion? I told Jasmine I needed to think, thanked her for listening, and after we hung up, I sat on my couch staring at my phone, at Madison's name in my contacts, and I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I called her, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and when she answered with that bright fake cheerfulness she always used, she said, "Emma, hi, what's up?" And I kept my voice carefully neutral as I said, "Hey, Madison, do you want to meet for coffee tomorrow? Maybe that place on South Congress around 2?" And there was the briefest pause before she said, "Of course, I'd love to catch up, it's been too long." And I said, "Great, see you then," and hung up before my resolve could crumble. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed rehearsing what I would say to her, how I would stay calm and state the facts, and not let her manipulate the conversation the way she always did. And I found myself remembering every time I'd made myself smaller, every accomplishment I'd downplayed, every hurt I'd swallowed because it was easier than causing conflict. And I realized this confrontation wasn't just about the promotion, it was about 28 years of pattern, of being the daughter and sister who accommodated everyone else's needs and feelings at the expense of my own. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and wrote down key points on my phone, reminders to stay calm, to state facts without getting emotional, to set clear boundaries regardless of how Madison reacted, and I made a decision that felt revolutionary in its simplicity. I decided that regardless of how my family reacted, regardless of whether they took Madison's side or accused me of overreacting or tried to guilt me into keeping the peace, I was done protecting Madison's feelings at the expense of my own well-being. I was done being the smaller sister in every sense of the word. I arrived at the coffee shop on South Congress 15 minutes early the next afternoon, needing time to steady myself before facing Madison, and I sat at a corner table watching the door and rehearsing my opening lines in my head, reminding myself to stay calm and state facts and not let her manipulate the conversation the way she always did. Madison breezed in exactly 10 minutes late, which was typical for her. She'd always made people wait as if her time was more valuable than everyone else's. And she was wearing this casual expression like nothing was wrong. Like this was just a normal sister's coffee date. And she ordered an elaborate latte before sitting down across from me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She asked how I was doing in that bright false voice she used when she was performing concern, and then before I could answer, she said, "So tell me about your little promotion. Did you hear anything back yet?" And the subtle dismissiveness in the phrase little promotion was so quintessentially Madison that I felt my resolve harden into something unshakable. I took a deep breath and said, "I know what you did, Madison." And I watched her face shift from casual friendliness to instant wariness, her eyes narrowing slightly as she said, "What are you talking about?" in a tone that was trying for confused, but came out defensive. I kept my voice calm and direct as I said, "You called my company trying to sabotage my promotion." And Madison's strategy was immediately to deny. She shook her head and said, "I don't know what you're talking about, Emma. You sound paranoid. Have you been under a lot of stress?" And I recognized the tactic, making me doubt my own reality, suggesting I was unstable. The same approach she'd apparently used on the phone with who she thought was my boss. I said, "You called and spoke to someone named David. You claimed I was lying about my accomplishments and exaggerating my sales numbers." And I watched her face pale slightly, though she kept denying, insisting I was confused or someone was playing a prank or I was taking something out of context, anything to avoid admitting what she'd done. I let her spin her denials for a moment, and then I said, "You gave your full name and phone number to the person you spoke to, Madison. You identified yourself as Madison Reeves." And she said, "This is insane. I would never do something like that. You're my sister." But I cut her off and said, "You called the CEO by mistake, David Park, instead of David Chen. There are 2 Davids at my company, and you called the wrong one." And I watched the complete shock and then horror spread across her face as she realized what I was saying, as she understood that her sabotage attempt hadn't just failed but had spectacularly backfired. She tried to recover, shifting tactics with desperate speed, and she said, "Emma, I was trying to help. I was worried about you. You've been so stressed and I thought maybe you were taking on too much too fast." And I just looked at her and said, "Help? You told them I was unstable and lying about my numbers. How exactly is that helping me, Madison?" Madison's defenses crumbled in real time as I watched, and she switched from denial to offense, with the desperation of someone who knew they'd been caught, her face flushing red as she said, "You always have to make everything about you, don't you?" And I felt the familiar old guilt reflex activate before I consciously shut it down, because I wasn't going to let her manipulate me this time, wasn't going to accept blame for her actions. She leaned forward, her voice rising slightly as she said, "I've been struggling, Emma. I've been having a really hard time at work and with my marriage, and you just keep succeeding and succeeding like you're doing it deliberately to rub it in my face." And I realized with a strange clarity that Madison genuinely believed this, that in her mind she was somehow the victim in this situation, that my success was something I was doing to her rather than something I was doing for myself. She continued, her words tumbling out faster now. "Do you know how hard it is to watch you get everything so easily when I'm working twice as hard and getting nowhere? Do you have any idea what that feels like?" And I felt something shift in me because I did know what that felt like. I'd spent my entire childhood watching her get everything while I was overlooked, but I'd never tried to destroy her opportunities because of it. Madison said, "Mom and Dad paid for your college too. You got the same things I did. We were treated exactly the same." And I realized she actually believed this revisionist history, that she'd either never known or had convinced herself to forget the actual facts. So I said calmly, "They paid yours in full, Madison. Every semester, every textbook, every fee. I graduated with $40,000 in loans that I just finished paying off last year." Her face showed confusion and then dismissal as she said, "That's not... They said they treated us equally. They wouldn't have..." But I cut her off and said, "They gave you $30,000 for your wedding. I was at that dinner when Dad handed you the check, and when I got engaged, they offered me $5,000 and said that was generous." I watched her process this, watched her try to find a way to deny it, and then I continued listing the disparities she'd been oblivious to, the family celebrations for her accomplishments, while mine got a distracted, "That's nice, dear," the way my career was dismissed as just sales, while her retail management was praised as real work requiring real skills. The pattern of minimization and dismissal that had been my normal for 28 years. Madison said, "Well, maybe if you hadn't chosen such an expensive school." And I said, "We went to the same school, Madison, the same state university. We sat at the same graduation." And I watched her face as she couldn't deny that fact, couldn't spin it into something that was somehow my fault. She shifted tactics again with the speed of long practice, her expression morphing into wounded hurt as she said, "I'm your sister, Emma. You should want to help me feel better, not make me feel worse about myself. That's what family does. They support each other." And I felt the old programming try to kick in, the lifetime of training that Madison's feelings were more important than my own. But I said clearly and firmly, "I'm done making myself smaller so you can feel bigger." I told her I needed space from her, from the family dinners where my accomplishments were minimized and my career dismissed, from the constant subtle competition I'd never agreed to participate in, and Madison's face shifted from hurt to anger as she said, "You're going to ruin this family over a misunderstanding? You're going to tear us all apart because you can't handle a little sisterly concern?" Madison called our parents before I even made it back to my car. I could tell because my phone started buzzing with missed calls from my mother within 20 minutes of leaving the coffee shop. And I let them go to voicemail because I needed time to process what had just happened, and I knew whatever conversation was coming wouldn't be productive while I was still this raw. I finally answered on the fourth call that evening, after I'd had time to sit in my apartment and just breathe and remind myself that I'd done nothing wrong. And my mother Linda's voice had that particular tone of disappointment that had been the soundtrack of my childhood, the one that made me feel small and wrong before she even said what I'd supposedly done. She said, "Madison is devastated, Emma. She's absolutely devastated. She says you're accusing her of terrible things and refusing to listen to her side." And I tried to explain what had actually happened, tried to tell her about the call to my CEO and the lies Madison had told. But my mother cut me off with, "Why can't you just apologize and move on, Emma?" Why does everything have to be such a drama with you? Family is more important than some job. I felt something crack open in my chest at those words. At the casual dismissal of my career as some job, when it was my livelihood and my achievement, and something I'd worked incredibly hard for. And I said with as much calm as I could manage, "She tried to get me fired, Mom. She called my company's CEO with lies about me being unstable and dishonest." My mother's response was, "She says she was trying to help, that she's worried about you, that you've been under so much stress and she thought someone should know." And I realized Madison had spun the entire story to make herself the concerned sister and me, the unstable one, had positioned her sabotage as care and my confrontation as irrational anger. My father Robert got on the phone then, his voice heavy with that particular exhaustion he always had when his daughters were fighting, and he said, "Your sister is in tears, Emma. She's really upset. What's this really about?" And I tried to explain the pattern, the years of being overlooked and minimized and dismissed, but he said, "You girls always had equality in this house. We treated you exactly the same. And Madison needs our support right now because she's going through a difficult time with her job and her marriage." I felt something snap inside me at those words, at the assertion of equality that was so fundamentally untrue, at the automatic prioritization of Madison's needs over mine, even in a situation where she'd actively tried to destroy my career. And I said, "When is it my turn to be supported, Dad? When do I get to be the one whose feelings matter?" And there was silence on the line, like the question had never occurred to either of them. I said into that silence, "I got promoted to senior account executive. It's a huge opportunity with a major salary increase and leadership responsibilities, and neither of you has even congratulated me. Neither of you has even asked about it." And my mother said, "Well, congratulations, Emma, but that doesn't excuse the way you're treating your sister right now. It doesn't excuse you tearing this family apart." I realized in that moment that nothing I said would matter, that the pattern was too entrenched, and their investment in Madison as the golden child was too deep. And I said, "I need to go. I'll reach out when I'm ready." And I hung up before either of them could respond. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down, but I also felt strangely powerful, like I'd finally stopped participating in a dynamic that had been hurting me for 28 years, like I'd chosen myself for the first time in my life. Jasmine came over that evening with wine and Thai food, and she let me talk through everything and cry and rage, and then help me see that I'd done exactly the right thing, that setting boundaries wasn't cruel even though my family would frame it that way. And I fell asleep on my couch feeling emotionally exhausted, but also somehow lighter than I had in years. 3 months later, I was thriving in my new role in ways I hadn't even imagined possible, leading a team of 4 account executives who actually respected my leadership and sought my advice. And I'd brought in 2 major clients worth a combined $1.4 million, which had David Chen joking that I was making him look bad, and David Park sending a personal congratulations email. My contact with my family had dwindled to occasional text messages, polite but distant, and I hadn't attended a family dinner since that phone call with my parents, hadn't sat through another meal where my accomplishments were minimized, while Madison's struggles were treated as evidence of her admirable work ethic. Madison had sent one half-hearted apology text about 2 weeks after our coffee shop confrontation. Just, "Sorry if I upset you. That wasn't my intention," which was so perfectly crafted to avoid actual accountability that I didn't even respond, just archived it and moved on with my life. My parents still thought I was overreacting, still sent occasional guilt-tripping messages about how families should forgive and move forward, and how much Madison missed me. But I'd started working with a therapist named Dr. Chen, who was helping me process the family dynamics and understand that boundary setting wasn't cruelty, even though my family framed it that way. I realized through those therapy sessions that I'd spent 28 years seeking approval I was never going to receive, chasing validation from people who had decided long ago that Madison's needs mattered more than mine, and that the only way to break that pattern was to stop participating in it entirely. The company holiday party in mid-December was held at a nice hotel ballroom in downtown Austin, and David Park publicly recognized my Q4 achievements in front of the entire Austin office, talking about my leadership and client relationships and contributions to company culture. And my team cheered genuinely, and several colleagues I barely knew came up afterward to congratulate me and say they'd heard great things. I received a text from Madison that evening as I was riding home with Jasmine, a family group message actually, with my mother saying they were planning Christmas dinner and hoping I would come, and I looked at that message for a long time before I typed out a polite decline and said I'd visit them separately on my own terms, setting a new precedent that my time and my boundaries and my emotional well-being were mine to control. Jasmine had gotten promoted too, to senior sales engineer, and we celebrated together over dinner at our favorite Thai place, toasting to success and chosen family, and the freedom that came from finally putting ourselves first. I reflected that night as I lay in bed that losing my family's approval had been terrifying, had felt like the worst possible outcome I could imagine. But it had actually freed me to succeed in ways I'd been unconsciously holding myself back from, as if some part of me had always known that my success would cost me their love, and I'd been trying to stay small enough to keep it. My apartment was decorated for the holidays with a small tree in the corner and lights strung along the windows, and I was hosting my own gathering the next weekend for friends from work and Jasmine and a few people from my book club, people who celebrated my successes without resentment and who saw my worth without me having to constantly prove it. I had a family photo on my bookshelf, one from Madison's wedding where we all looked happy and united, and I felt sadness when I looked at it now, but also a strange peace, an acceptance that the family in that photo wasn't the family I'd actually had, just the one I'd wanted to believe existed. I realized that family didn't have to mean unconditional acceptance of mistreatment, that I could love my parents and my sister from a distance while still protecting myself from their patterns, that setting boundaries wasn't the same as burning bridges, even though they'd tried to frame it that way. I got a message from David Park on a Wednesday afternoon asking if I had time for a brief call, and when we spoke, he told me the company was expanding the Austin office significantly next year, and he wanted me to interview for a director of sales position that would be created in Q2, overseeing multiple teams and helping shape the office's growth strategy. I smiled as I thanked him and said I'd absolutely be interested, and after we hung up, I immediately texted Jasmine the news, and for the first time in my entire life, I didn't hesitate or minimize the achievement or worry about how sharing good news might make someone else feel bad about themselves. I spent that evening on my couch with a glass of wine and my journal, reflecting on how much had changed in 3 months, how the crisis with Madison had actually been the catalyst I'd needed to finally break free from patterns that had been holding me back my entire life. I wrote in my journal something that felt true in a way few things ever had, writing the words slowly and carefully so I could come back to them whenever I doubted myself. And what I wrote was, I spent 28 years trying to earn my family's pride, measuring my worth by their approval, making myself smaller so they'd love me more, and it turned out that I only needed to earn my own. I closed the journal and looked around my apartment at the life I'd built, the career I'd earned, the peace I'd fought for, and I felt something I'd never quite felt before, a bone-deep satisfaction with who I was and what I'd accomplished that didn't require anyone else's validation to feel real.